welcome to part 2 of the Cardalist platform video tutorial series. Today's episode is called Post-Install Configuration, and I'm going to walk you through some key configuration changes that I typically make anytime I roll out a new platform installation. My name is Ben Johnson. I'm the Cardalist Community Liaison, and I'm glad to have you here with me today. Last we left it, we had just finished installing Platform. It looks just like this. We had logged in and looked at some of the administrative capabilities of the application right out of the box. And today we're going to focus on primarily two things. The environment configuration, which is extremely important because it's sort of the heart of your application configuration. And then all of the attendant config files that are in the config directory off the root of your application. You might recall that we had peeked at this hidden.env file in the previous episode. And one of the things I mentioned was that this file is really aimed towards sensitive credentials that really shouldn't be committed to source control in any capacity, whether you're using GitHub or some internal Git instance on your LAN, perhaps if you're in a corporate environment. The env file in Laravel is powered by the vLucas library. I'm just going to hop over to the GitHub page right here, which I would recommend visiting and reading about. It's important in that it explains the why and sort of the how of the env file. So at your leisure, I would go ahead and just run through that documentation quickly. It's not all that long. And to see how these values are essentially getting into the application, let's just look at a real example. This is app.php that is a stock Laravel file. Many of these have been modified to work with Platform. They're custom tailored. You'll notice there's some Cardalist prefixed and platform dash prefixed configuration files here. So this one happens to be one that comes with a stock Laravel install though. And you'll notice right here that there's a call to Laravel's env helper function, which essentially goes into this .env file and then pulls out the value that matches the configuration directive. So app debug we see right here. This is just the default value. If it's not defined by this key in the env file, this will be used. And I also want to just take this opportunity to share with you a little tip that I think fixes one of the most frustrating issues I've run into with Laravel and Platform together. It's really neither one's fault, but it's important to mention that this URL is used throughout the asset compilation process and ends up in CSS files, JS files, potentially in anywhere you might have a reference to it. And it can be really problematic if, for example, you're not developing on localhost. I'm using platform.dev, which is just an entry in my host file on my local development server. So if those two don't match up, if what I'm using in the browser, so if I jump back over here, you'll see that up here, I've got platform.dev, but by default in this config file, I've got localhost, and that's going to cause problems, and it causes 404s, and it can be really frustrating to troubleshoot. I'm not really sure why a protocol is prepended to this value. What I've found is that if you actually set this to an empty string, the URLs that are generated begin with a slash, and it doesn't matter whether you're using HTTP or HTTPS, everything just works the same way. I have yet to run into a problem with setting this to an empty string. There might be certain places in the artisan command line environment where this value is used. I haven't run into any that have been problematic, so I'd recommend that you make this change too. So what we can do is wrap this empty string in a call to the env helper, and we're going to call this app URL, copy it, and over in the env file we're just going to add a new line and set it to an empty string. That way we're doubly assured our default value here is an empty string if for whatever reason it's not defined in the env file, which it is. We should get a nice clean URL when those assets are generated, and that whole problem just goes right away. This is a good time to mention the env example file, which you see right here. I'll open that up. The whole idea is that essentially this example file would be provided to, say, a new developer or anybody that checked out your source code and was working with your application. It essentially defines the configuration directives that must exist for everything to work smoothly. So anytime you add something to the env file, you'll typically want to add it over there too, just so people that use the application will know that that's an essential setting. So I just went ahead and made that change and added the app URL call that I fashioned right here to the example file, and I'll end up committing that later. One thing to note too is that the env example file is perfectly safe to commit, because the idea is that you're never putting sensitive information of any kind in here. You're just using dummy default values that people will understand need to be replaced. And of course, the env file should never be committed to source control for obvious reasons, that if there are usernames and passwords there, you don't want those floating around on the internet or in anyone else's control. So there are git ignore rules defined in the Git repository that we've cloned that tell Git just to not to source control this file essentially, and to ignore it. With regard to the config directory here and all these files that are deployed stock, right out of the box to this location, those are all essentially copies of configuration files included with various extensions and vendor packages that are included in the application. And the vendor publish command, which is an artisan command, vendor:publish, essentially pushes all those configuration files from the vendor directories that are associated into this location. There are two things that are really important to understand about this particular directory and the files therein, and one of which is that these files will never be overwritten rather by the vendor publish command. So if you find yourself working on an extension and maybe you've got a configuration file that goes with it and you're updating it and running vendor publish and wondering why your changes aren't reflected, which we've all done, and it's incredibly frustrating until you realize what's happening, is that file already exists and it's necessary to delete it, then run vendor publish again for your changes to become effective. And the second thing that's important to mention is that these files are custom tailored for platforms. So if you delete one and then run vendor publish and it puts it back, there's certainly no guarantee that the file that is used as a replacement is going to be the same as the file that was deployed with platform. So be careful about deleting anything there unless you're absolutely sure what you're doing. My personal development philosophy here is not to modify any of these files if I can help it. Everything that can be done through the env file should, in my opinion. That's for a couple of different reasons, one of which is that merging in upstream changes from the platform project will be a lot simpler if you haven't modified anything. You won't have to reconcile conflicts for files that you may have changed that have since been updated upstream. That's a big reason. It makes upgrading as painless as possible. And the other reason is that I work in a multi-developer environment most of the day. And for us to be able to sort of keep everything straight and ensure that our respective environments are configured identically, we don't change these files on our own particular workstations. We try to leave those completely stock and then stick solely to the env file for any environment-specific configuration values that are necessary for the app to function correctly. For that reason, I can commit anything that's in this directory. That also helps to keep me and the other members on my team all on the same page, so to speak, anytime we add some new configuration directives. So in other words, basic rule is that if it's something that should be the same on every single deployment, I would say to go ahead and make it here and commit it, if that's your prerogative. Otherwise, I would put it in the env file. Just to quickly show you what that vendor publish command looks like. We'll let it run through, and we see that it copied a couple of directories. This was from an earlier run when I was testing this, and you can see that it copied a lot more, and the list is so much shorter because the configuration files therein are not being overwritten this time. Another aspect of platform's configuration-related behavior that I'd like to mention is something called the composite config package, which is another Catalyst package that is included as a part of platform. And essentially what it does is it allows you to have configuration directives in the database that will always take precedence over any same named directives that might be defined via these files here in the config directory that we've been looking at. Essentially, it's a mechanism for defining values and then having sensible fallbacks that will be effective should those values not exist in the database. By default, the config table is empty. So we're essentially deferring to all these values that we see as defined in the config directory. The only other aspect of platform's initial configuration that I'd like to bring your attention to is something that we actually need to log in to see, and it's related to themes and has significant performance implications. So I think it's important to be aware of those settings and where they live and how to set them throughout various stages of your development processes. So if we click the little toggle icon up there and go to Preferences and then the Themes tab, we see these three settings right here, and the defaults are sensible. Those are certainly the most performant settings, but it's important to understand how setting this to enabled affects the way that assets are generated and named throughout your application. We'll get more into platform's asset queuing mechanisms in a future lesson, but the important thing to know is that when this debug status is set to enabled, all of your assets, they won't be concatenated, essentially is what will happen, which can make it a lot easier to troubleshoot. You can see those assets individually in your browser's development tools console, whereas when this setting is set to disabled, those files all get concatenated into a single resource to reduce the number of HTTP requests that are made, thereby incurring overhead. So definitely want to have that set to disabled for normal operation. Force asset recompilation. This will essentially, on every request, force the assets to be recompiled. It's obvious why that could have significant performance implications if that's set to yes. And then a similar setting right below is whether or not to auto clear them on every request. And again, that just incurs additional overhead, but it can eliminate some caching issues and things that can trip you up when you're developing a theme. These two drop-down menus control the theme that's specified for both the admin area that we're looking at now and then the front end that we were looking at earlier. We'll get into those in a bit more depth in the next episode, in which we'll create our first theme. That's basically it for the configuration. With just a couple of small tweaks, we're in pretty good shape, and we should have sensible defaults that serve as the basis for a well-configured app. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.